Welcome to the Motherhood podcast with Denise Waters.
Hi, it's Denise from the Motherhood, and I'm so glad you're here for our podcast this week. As we are laying the groundwork for what will come, I really wanted to introduce you today to some of the questions that we're going to ask here on the podcast. And the first one is, who are the people in your life who have had the biggest impact on who you were as a mom? I'm going to take a minute and answer that for me. And a little bit of this gets into the crazy family tree that I live with in my life. My husband is always like, how is that person related? I don't know if it matters, but I think it's a good part of the story that we're all a little bit unique with our pieces of the story. And so when I think about this question, I think about who are the women in my life who influenced the type of mom that I would be. And I can't start that conversation without talking about my female relatives. I have been so fortunate that I was raised by this pack of wolves to create the person I am today and the mom that I was or am. The mom I was when they were little. I think of it and I say to the kids all the time, I was raised by wolves. And that might sound negative, but I don't mean it that way. I mean it like these were strong, badass women who went into the world and made their own space. And they expected me to kind of come along with them. There was no pampering, there was no day spas, there were no pedicures. And so I had to figure out all the things that I know today, really kind of like by trial and error. They taught me a lot of really good things, but it definitely wasn't how to be the perfect mom, the perfect woman. It was how to live a really interesting life. So let's just jump in with who I am and how I fit with all these crazy women in my life. So I'm an only child, but also the oldest of six kids. My parents were married and got divorced when I was really young, and they both remarried. My stepdad brought a daughter with him into the new marriage, and then they had two sons. And my father remarried and had two kids on his side as well. So I am 7, 8, 10, and 12 years older than my half siblings and a few years older than my stepsister. I don't have a relationship with half of them by choice, I think mostly. And that has informed my motherhood journey for sure, in that family matters, but not at the cost of high drama. So my stepsister decided that she didn't want to come to our house regularly. And so there were a lot of fights and drama around that. And so we really lost touch that way. And then I decided that I didn't really want to spend every other weekend at my dad's when I was in high school, and then college was a whole other part of the story. And so we have kind of distanced that part of the family as well. I don't know if I'm proud of either of those parts. I do not understand it, and it makes me horribly sad. Like depressingly sad that there are people in my life who I have abandoned or who have abandoned me. And I don't use that word lightly because there's a lot of trauma that comes with it. There's a lot of therapy that's come along with it to figure out how that's impacted me and how it's impacted my kids because of my experience. But it's a part of the story and it's not the whole story. So we'll come back to it over time about how that's impacted me. But it is a pattern in my biological family. And I want to ensure that as I parent, that I am always watching out for patterns. And that's a really, really important part. So let's jump back a little bit and just go through some of the patterns because we can learn from them. So when you look at your own genealogy and then decide to use it as part of your parenting story, it's really important to have touch points, places where you know a story, something that tethers you to that part of the genealogy. You can do all the research in the world and you can learn about people, but if you didn't have a direct link to them, they're not really a part of your journey. Their story might matter. Their story might be inspiring. It might be all of the things, but it didn't impact you in the way that you show up every day. We talk about generational trauma. That absolutely exists. If you had severe poverty and neglect and abandonment generationally, that is going to impact how your nervous system works. And you have the opportunity to learn about it and to grow from it. But the people who actually impacted your life, the people you knew, you're actually picking up things from them all the time, whether positive or negative. They play into your story. And so my story as a mom involves this amazing list of humans, of women who I'm going to talk about today and how they're tied to me. And some of those little anecdotes or snapshot even of who they are and what their impact has been on my motherhood journey. So we're going to go back as far as I can remember, the oldest person I can remember, and that is my great-grandma Granny. Alma Caroline Perlette was her name when I met her, and she was just a badass. She traveled the world. She had one son and she had many marriages. Okay, two marriages. And then she just lived this amazing life. She never drove. She would take care of me when I was a little girl. And one of the stories that matters the most to me is looking at the moon. I remember we would leave her house and the moon would be out and she would talk about it following me home. And then we would get home and we would call her and I would tell her that it did follow me all the way home. I just remember that. Like, it was so important. There's a lot of other stories that I have with her because she was a really integral part in my life. As I know her now as an adult and I know her history, super interested in how she lived the life she did. She was born in 1898 and died in 1998. And just this rich, rich story. But the real interesting thing is what I took away from my relationship with her and how that impacted my motherhood was just this unconditional love, person who loved adventure, going places, having special things. She had a vase behind her front door that every time I went to her house, there was a gift in there for us, one for me and one for each of my brothers, a toy that we could play with. And I just, like, she made every day special. From sugar cubes in my coffee to trips, she just made every day special. And I really hope that I took that lesson away from her and used that in my parenting. She was the mom of my grandfather, my mom's dad, Bert. Yeah, she was a pretty special lady. And so let's stay with my mom's side of the family. My mom's mom, Sarah, and what I got from her and her mom. So I didn't know her mom, and she didn't either. So this is an important part of my story and an important part of our family story is this firsthand knowledge with something that is in the news quite often now. My grandmother and her two siblings were being raised in Missouri in the late 20s, early 30s, and her mom, Melba, got pregnant again with their fourth, and it would have been four little kids, and they couldn't afford it. She was a singer and a dancer on vaudeville and really talented, but they couldn't afford to have a fourth child. And so she did have an illegal abortion and then ended up dying from it. That has been a part of our family lore from the time that I could remember. When other families weren't talking about abortion, our family was. When people would have debates about whether abortion should be legal or illegal in high school or middle school, I just remember those dialogues with both my mom and my grandma talking about it, and how my grandma's life would have been different if that hadn't have been the case. And so it's really personal to our family, and I really took that to heart, that how the world's rules can impact you personally. Then my grandmother, Sarah, she moved to California and moved with her dad and her two siblings, and her dad needed help. And so he enlisted the help of this woman named Doris and her sister Vera, and they were young. Doris and Vera were supposed to come over on the Titanic, and I believe it was Vera who got sick, and so they couldn't travel, and so they came on the next ship. And meanwhile, while they were coming over on the next ship, the Titanic did indeed sink. And knowing their station in life, they would have been in a position where they wouldn't have survived that. So that's a big piece of my story that we'll talk more about when we get to Doris. But Doris was basically employed to take care of Julius Oscar Wagner's 3 children and moved to California with him. And when they moved to California, they ultimately got married and had another daughter, Leona May Wagner, my great aunt, and the woman who I credit a lot of my life to. But let's stick with the story a little bit further. So I want to continue to talk about Sarah. So Sarah, right, lost her mom to an illegal abortion and then moved with this woman and her father, probably 10 or 12 years older than her, to California, where he ultimately married her and then had another daughter. Julius Oscar Wagner and Doris divorced, I think, in a time that never happened. And then she remarried. Doris remarried to Willie Warren, and they had 2 more kids. And so that is Sarah's stepmom and my really close family. So we'll talk about them, but I want to stick on Sarah. So this is what's really hard when you ask about the people who made a difference in your life. You have to explain who they are, or it doesn't always make sense that it's just this random person in your life. Depending on your audience, you can get into the weeds about it, or you can stay pretty high level and just say, my grandmother taught me about X, Y, or Z. But for the purpose of today, I really wanted to put it in context because families aren't simple. And the complicated relationship and the way that people are connected impacts the impact they have on me or on you. So Sarah, having moved to California with her nanny turned stepmom, she then got married pretty young and married Bert, my grandfather, and there's so many stories here. And had 6 kids. So I had my mom, and then Linda and Sally and Bert and Randy and Leanne. And then they split, and it was not pretty. And he married another woman who already had 3 kids, and then they had 1 more. So my mom is technically the oldest of 10, but really the oldest of 6, and has 3 stepbrothers and a half-brother. Her half-brother is 21 years younger than she is. So we have that really in common. But that divorce for Sarah, between Sarah and Bert, was devastating. My grandfather was in politics, and they have postcards and bumper stickers and pictures of this perfect, happy family, and then it was gone. And while that also impacted my mom, it really impacted Sarah, my grandmother. She was a sad, abandoned, bitter woman. She was never happy. that I can remember, ever. um, she was one of the smartest people I knew, and she was one of the bravest and most accomplished women I know, even though she was divorced and sad and didn't drive for a long time and smoked. But she was professionally amazing. She worked as an executive secretary in the time where those women ran the show. She worked for some very powerful men, and she was very successful at it. She also raised the 6 humans that I love probably more than anyone on earth, like my mom and her siblings. And so to think about her as this broken human is really, really touching, because she could have been so much. And yet she was so angry, and rightfully so, right? That was the story of her life. I think of some very specific times with her where there were good times, where she kind of could let some of that go. But her relationship with me was really complicated. I was the oldest of the oldest. My mom was her oldest child, and I was the oldest granddaughter. And I was a pain in the ass a good portion of my growing up time. And I think that Sarah saw a lot of herself in me and a lot of potential that she was jealous of. She wanted a life for herself that she didn't get to have. And I often represented that life, which is interesting. Because that implies that there's competition in our family. And I think that's true. And I think that's sad. And I think that has impacted my parenting. So, two things that I've really, really learned from Sarah. And one is how abandonment can lead to real severe bitterness. And that was something I was going to choose to not have in my life and choose not to lean into as a parent. And when we really get into my story, I think there's times when that could have been my natural reaction. But because I had Sarah in my life, I chose not to do that. And then the other thing that I really take away from Sarah in my life is that you can always learn, you can always improve, you can always do more. I see that in her, and yet I don't know if she knew that about herself, but she constantly reinvented herself. She was like I said, one of the smartest people I know, and she was one of the most talented people I know. She could sing, she could dance, she could do all the things, she could create, she could do art. Like, she was just really talented. And if she had landed in a different family in a different time, she would have been a different person. But I do think about her, and I think about those lessons of abandonment, but also like owning your story, have been really important in my parenting journey. Did I say specifically what I learned from Granny? Maybe just that unconditional love. She thought the world of me. I also think about her, and kind of a life lesson that I learned from her is that family matters. She cared deeply about family reunions and preserving the past and making sure you knew your family tree, and that how people were connected. And I do really appreciate that about her, as well as both of those women loved the written word. So that has been a theme that has held. I want to talk about Doris. So Sarah's stepmom, who ended up being my grandma Mimi, who I would see almost daily in high school. And when I was younger, she lived on my route to school. And so I got to see her almost every day. There's some great stories from that house, and the cookie jar that was in the driveway door is in my house now, because that meant such a lot to me. But let's talk about her a little bit. So Doris and Vera came over, not on the Titanic. We are very grateful, and married into this family that had survived tragedy of their own in Missouri, and they all found themselves in California. Vera lived down the street from my father's family, and so if you're not from San Diego, you might not know what a small town it is, but all of these people and all of these stories are interrelated because San Diego was such a small town back in the day. So Vera lived just around the corner from the Dobranskis, and married into the Betts side of the family. So while Julia's Oscar Wagner left the picture with these 4 young kids that Doris was 3, stepmom to, and then Leona, who she was mom to, she then had 2 of her own with Grandpa Willie, and that's Rick and Larry. And Vera had her 1 son, Richie, and those are all the people that I spent Christmas Eve with and holidays with and camping in the desert with, and still see today, the ones that are still with us. And so they created this community for all of us to be in all of the time. Whether that was Sunday night dinners that their kind of immediate family experienced, and then they brought us in sometimes for dessert, or the Christmas celebrations, or just the daily, day in, day out family life. There was definitely a community there. I also saw it from my grandma, from Sarah's perspective, that she always felt a little bit on the outs with Mimi's family, Doris's family. And I always chalk that up to numbers. When you have that many kids, and Sarah had 6, it was hard to invite them all over. It was hard to do gifts for everybody. We weren't a rich family. We all kind of got by and did our thing. But I could see how that hierarchy impacted my grandma Sarah as we went through life. But I never felt it from Doris, from Mimi. She included me as her own, and she really impacted me from just that sense of community and kind love that she gave to everybody around her. And her sister Vera was very much the same way. And I would even say that Richie and Tina, that line from that side of the family, that's what I see from them every day, is kindness and community and fun. They like to have a good time also. And so I think that I've brought that piece to my family through my motherhood, is that we do have a good time, and we like to include others, and we like to kind of expand our circle so that other people can be in it. And that directly ties back to my grandma Mimi and her sister, Aunt Vera. I guess we'll talk about the other side of the family, Tom's side of the family, my dad's side of the family. His mom died in 83, so I was 11, 10, math, 11. What I learned from Anne Dobransky is that you can be in a lot of pain and cause a lot of pain and still have it all be based in love. So I don't know. I only know up until I was 10. But she was sick most of my life: breast cancer, lung cancer, brain cancer, all of the things. And yet she loved me desperately. And I knew that when I walked into the room, that everything would stop and she would dedicate her time and attention to me. And I loved that. I loved being kind of the center of somebody's world. And she was mean as the day is long. She was mean to my mom. I think she was mean to her kids. She had 3 boys, like I have 3 boys. So I often wonder about the mental health aspect of having 3 boys, because I do think that impacted her. Also being sick impacted her. But I remember yelling, screaming, horrible conversations the night before my Uncle Mark got married, like yelling in the street about not going to weddings and skipping out and just unkindness. And I think that came from mental health problems. I think that came from alcoholism. I think it came from basic pain of being unwell. And what I took away from that was to be careful that my pain and my history could cause pain to others, and that I really needed to check myself, that I needed to enter into conversations with kindness, even when I was upset. It didn't always work. I would also yell at my children, especially when Tim was deployed, but I would always apologize and I would always try and learn from it. And I think that I think that I've grown in that way. I also never smoked and I don't drink soda or diet soda. I try and keep a very healthy life because I know that I am prone to a lot of horrible diseases. The other thing I learned from Anne is that you can have community around you and not use it. And okay, so I know that about Anne. I haven't always embraced it. So an interesting story is that Granny, Alma, Bert's mom, and Anne, Tom's mom, worked together at the same bakery. Told you San Diego is a small town. So they all knew each other when Tom and Terry started dating up in Davis, and then they came home to introduce the families. The families already knew each other because they had worked together, which I find ironic. But the community that Alma, Granny, created around herself by the experiences she had sustained her. Whereas Anne was privy to those same community elements, and yet she isolated herself, and ultimately that didn't help her to feel better, to engage with the world in a better way, and really spiraled in a negative way. And so I tried to know that lesson and leave myself open to other people around me so that I could parent as part of a community. I didn't always do it. I don't always do it, but it's a lesson that sticks with me. So the original question was, who are the women who have had the most impact on you, and what was that impact on your motherhood journey? And in a very circuitous route, I have talked about my grandparents and great-grandparents and how they've made that impact. Finally, I want to talk about my aunt, my Noni. She was my grandmother, Sarah's younger sister, and my mom lived with her when she was in high school, and they had a very, very close relationship. And again, being the oldest of the oldest, I got to have that same relationship too. She was an amazing woman, strong, powerful, commanded a room. She kind of always had her shit together. Again, small town San Diego. She was the younger sister of Sarah, and she married Bert's best friend, Uncle Bill, because that's what you did when it was the 1940s. And she was married to Uncle Bill for her whole life. They had one son, my cousin Ken, and we lost him, 14 years ago, 13 years ago. And that has changed all of us. But the story I want to tell about Noni is I mean, she was my always favorite. We haven't talked about my mom and her sister, so we'll get there in a minute. But Noni of that generation was my favorite. And we just had a lot of fun together. She was a pretty remarkable woman. But when Kenny died, she said to me how unfair it was. She had tried really hard to get pregnant with him and had miscarriages along the way and finally got him. And And then he died, and she was pissed. She was sad. She was broken by it. I think it ultimately killed her. And I, I just, I just know that to survive the loss of a child, you have to do some remarkable things. I know people who have, and they've come out the other side, but I also know people who haven't. And it has broken them to a place of like they just can't go on. What I've learned from that is that I love my children desperately, and we have been in some interesting circumstances where I've worried about them. And what I know to be true is that I love them. And if I were to lose them, it would ruin me. And it would be my responsibility to the rest of us to pick myself back up and figure out how to go forward. And while Noni only had one child, and so she was unable to do that, she loved him so desperately that it was the end of her. But she also had a daughter-in-law and grandchildren at that point, and they could have used her. And so that is one of the big lessons that I take away from that, is that no matter what happens, no matter who is in our life and for how long they're in our life, it is our responsibility to pick ourselves back up and be the person that everybody left in our life needs us to be. So that's a big lesson that I've learned. And finally today, I've said finally twice, but I'm going to finally be done at this point and say the other women who have made such an impact on my life are my aunts and my mom, my Aunt Linda, my Aunt Leanne, my Aunt Kathy, my Aunt Kathy on the other side, even Linda and Beth. There are some stories there that, but lessons that I've learned. But the true takeaway from all of that is having multiple people surrounding you in love matters. And so while I don't have that same sibling group or cousin group that my mom had, what we have done as a family is make sure that we have wrapped around our children with our friends who are family. And so that is a big lesson that I learned, that to have multiple adults raising your children is ultimately what makes motherhood powerful, is because you don't have to be everything to everybody. So that answers that first question. Who are the people who've had the most impact on you in your motherhood journey? So thank you for tuning in today. Next episode, I will talk about the second question that I will be asking my guests on the Motherhood podcast. But for today, that is my story, and I really appreciate you listening. Hope to see you very soon. Thank you for joining us for the Motherhood podcast. Please subscribe and like so that we can keep bringing you more episodes.